Welcome, everyone. I'm Carolyn Waters, head librarian here at the New York Society Library, the oldest library and cultural institution in New York City. And of course, we are located at 53 East 79th Street, just a mere block from our beloved Central Park, which is, of course, the subject of tonight's lecture. We are delighted to have Sara Cedar Miller with us to discuss her new book, Before Central Park, which is the authoritative account of the place that would become Central Park. Central Park is, of course, an urban masterpiece designed in the mid-19th century by landscape architects Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux. But before it became Central Park, the land was the site of farms, businesses, churches, wars, and burial grounds, and home to many different kinds of New Yorkers. Sara Cedar Miller tells the stories of indigenous hunters, enslaved people and enslavers, American patriots and British loyalists, the Black landowners of Seneca Village, Irish pig farmers, tavern owners, Catholic sisters, Jewish protesters, and more. Miller unveils a British fortification and camp during the Revolutionary War, a suburban retreat from the yellow fever epidemics at the turn of the 19th century, and the properties that a group of free Black Americans used to secure their right to vote. Sara Cedar Miller is uniquely qualified to tell this story, as she is the historian emerita of the Central Park Conservancy, which she first joined as a photographer in 1984. I was recently speaking with Elizabeth Barlow Rogers, who I know many of you know, who was appointed as the first administrator of Central Park and who founded the Central Park Conservancy in 1980. Betsy told me that when she hired Sara to document the ongoing progress of the projects that were the ongoing fulfillment of the Conservancy's management and restoration plan, she didn't realize that she was gaining a staff member who would become the park's principal historian and author of so many lavishly illustrated books about the park. I know that Betsy is out there somewhere watching tonight, and she told me how especially proud she is of Sara for digging deeper, literally, than anyone ever has before into the fascinating history of the landscape that became Central Park. Sara Cedar Miller's other books include Central Park, an American Masterpiece, Strawberry Fields, Central Park's Memorial to John Lennon, and Seeing Central Park, the Official Guide. Please welcome Sara Cedar Miller.
I'm so honored that the New York Society Library, of which I am a very proud member, is giving me the opportunity to share stories from my new book, Before Central Park, from the valuable resources found in the collection to my beloved writing group. The library has played a major role in the research and writing of this book. And I'd also like to thank Carolyn and Sara Holliday for the invitation. So now I share the screen slideshow. There we go. Okay, so the research was a 7-year odyssey, but I must also credit the Central Park Conservancy, which has always been involved in aspects of park and pre-park history, and many of the findings in the book are from those findings from the Conservancy. Before Central Park focuses on 2.5 centuries of social and military history, also taking into account the millennia of use by indigenous peoples and the eons of the land's physical history. But it would be impossible to discuss today every aspect of it. So I have chosen instead to tell you 4 stories that represent different aspects of the park and different areas of the park. The book is divided into 3 sections: topography, real estate, and the idea of a park, for a park. Of course, Central Park did not exist as an entity until 1853. For almost 2 centuries before that, the 843-acre site was situated at the confluent edge of 3 different districts, and you can see them here on your screen to the left: Harlem, Bloomingdale, and Yorkville, also known as the Common Lands. They are seen on the left, and we'll start with Harlem. So, topography is destiny. The configuration of the physical features on land has always determined social history. Where the land favored cultivation and human habitation, it was settled. Where it was challenging and inhospitable, people neither lived on it nor invested in it. The terrain at the north end of the park, today's Harlemere, and surrounding landscape, both inside the park and adjacent to it, had a favorable topography that was actually unique to Manhattan Island. No other area had these many features, and saw over 2 centuries of settlement and incidents in military history. And now it is to one of those military history events that we now turn. But first we have to understand the lay of the land. Our Harlem story starts with the Wasquajic Trail, created by the local Lenape to navigate from their Bronx encampments to those at the tip of the island. To get there, they had to find a path of least resistance from the hundreds of hills and thousands of rock outcrops so prevalent throughout the terrain. Within the pre-park, the trail entered, and you can see on this map that the park is outlined in black. Within the pre-park, the trail entered at 110th Street at what is now Malcolm X Boulevard and ran, that also was 6th Avenue, ran south through a narrow opening in an east-west wall of rock that crosses Central Park still today at around 106th Street. It exited the pre-park onto 5th Avenue at about 92nd Street, and from there it headed east towards today's 3rd Avenue and then headed downtown to the Collect Pond, which was a major settlement area for the Lenape. During the 17th century, the trail became a Dutch wagon road, and when the English conquered the colony after 1664, the highway became known as the Kingsbridge Road, so called as travelers were required to pay a toll to one of the king's loyal subjects. Actually, that's why one of the reasons we fought a war. Its original surface, as you can see here, was comprised of millions of small stones and was surprisingly discovered in 2013 when the Central Park Conservancy was working in the area. The larger flat stones supported a fortification from the War of 1814, but it's those millions of small stones that were backbreaking to have to create this trail throughout the entire island. In the mid-18th century, that narrow opening in the rock became known as Mcgowan's Pass, named for the family that owned the land in the area. Today, it's a lovely path like many others in the park, but do not be fooled. Mcgowan's Pass is one of the most significant spots in the history of New York City. In this photo, you can see the narrow pass as the space between the 2 rocks on either side of the path. It was this pass that was an important strategic spot for the military. If you wanted to hold Manhattan Island, you needed to hold the pass. So during the Dutch and English colonial periods, taverns for locals and travelers dotted the Kingsbridge Road from one end of the island to the other, including the Bronx, to the Battery. The Mcgowan family operated a tavern along the road from 1756 until the Revolutionary War in 1776. This photograph is from 1814. I mean, it's watercolor. From the New York Historical Society is from 1814 when the family had added additions to the house, but during the Revolutionary War, of which we're going to speak, it would have been a little smaller. And in order to set the stage for the historic event that almost nobody knows about that took place at the tavern, we need to time travel back to September 7th, 1776, when General George Washington, who needs no introduction, and thousands of his mainly untrained rebel soldiers found themselves on Manhattan Island, surrounded by 34,000 British and Hessian troops aboard 427 ships. As the ships were sailing up both rivers, the burning question on Washington's mind was to stay and tough it out or to abandon New York. New York City was the most strategically important city that connected the colonies, the Hudson River to Canada, and the port to Europe. Holding it would mean almost certain victory for either side. On September 7th, at his headquarters in today's West Village, may or may not be this picture. I took it off the internet, but it is one of Washington's Council of War meetings. Washington and his generals held a Council of War meeting. Both psychologically and ethically, Washington was duty-bound to an 18th century code of honor, which included bravery, willpower, and moral rectitude. And under that code, he would stand his ground, persevere, even die, rather than abandon New York. A few generals wanted to burn the city down so the British troops wouldn't have winter quarters, but the Continental Congress in Philadelphia forbade it and advised the generals and Washington to stay and hold the city. But 5 days later, after a failed attempt at a peace conference on Staten Island, the situation worsened, and several of Washington's generals begged him to call another Council of War meeting. The location of the September 12th Council of War meeting has rarely been noted, but we know that it was held at Mcgowan's Tavern, temporarily the headquarters of General Alexander McDougall, here on the right, who was assigned there to protect the pass and the road. Although it was poor form to rescind a military decision, 9 of the 12 generals present, including McDougall, voted to evacuate, with only 3 generals dissenting, including General William Heath here on the left. McDougall was a hot-headed Scotsman who seethed with anger towards the pompous Heath, and especially because of his hypocritical vote. We know about the location of the secret Council of War meeting only because General McDougall let the cat out of the bag 6 years later. In 1782, the 2 men found themselves stationed together at West Point. Heath was McDougall's superior officer. One evening in January 1782, during what McDougall later called a social hour, quote unquote, and perhaps aided by strong drink, he revealed Heath's vote to a group of officers. As a result, Heath discharged McDougall from his command, placed him under arrest, and charged him with 7 counts of misconduct. At his court-martial, he was found guilty of only 1, revealing the secret meeting, which greatly angered General Washington, who was otherwise quite fond of McDougall. At 11 a.m. on September 15th, 3 days after the meeting, the British attacked New York at Kips Bay and 34th Street. Washington, who had moved his headquarters to the Morris Mansion, now the Morris Jumel Mansion at 160th Street in Harlem, raced down the Kingsbridge Road past Mcgowan's Tavern to reach his terrified troops who were deserting and were getting killed. He and his generals drove them west to Times Square and north on the Bloomingdale Road, now Broadway. In the meantime, the British went up the east side on the Kingsbridge Road, where the generals took Mcgowan's Tavern, and they slept in it and occupied it for the next 7 years. During the war, New York was only second to London as the largest British city. If you were in Philadelphia or Boston and you were loyal to the king, you couldn't stay there. You were an enemy. And so everyone moved to New York, and it became a major British city. Today, the site of Mrs. Mcgowan's Tavern and that very important historic meeting is the park's composting area. Very important to keep the park green. So, we love it, but of course, it is one of the most very important historic spots in Central Park. Earlier in the talk, I noted that topography was destiny. Where the land was poor, it was undesirable, and as such, owned by the city of New York. Nobody wanted it, and it was owned by the city since the Dutch era. That all changed by the end of the 18th century when real estate trumped topography as the determining factor for both investment and settlement. After the Revolution, New York was bankrupt, with barely any power to tax its citizens. Its only asset was the waste, as they called it, quote unquote, the common lands, and it was known also as Yorkville. It ran from 42nd Street North up to the 90s and also included very much of the Upper East Side. The city, needing money, divided its asset into lots in 1796, 5-acre lots. The dotted area was a great portion, the red dots, a great portion of what became Central Park. The city sold the green lots and held on to the yellow lots as rental property until the neighboring green lots were sufficiently improved so they could raise the price on the yellow ones. These are photographs that show the park's barren and fetid swamps, the rock outcrops, and the glacial boulders that covered the uneven terrain. One New Yorker, James Amory, bought his first common land lot because his family had been stricken with the mosquito-borne yellow fever in the fall of 1797. Like the recent COVID epidemic, it was thought that the disease was contagious. They didn't know about mosquitoes then. So no one could come near the family, and Amory, who fortunately remained healthy, probably because he wasn't bitten by a mosquito, was forced to nurse his wife and children by himself. Most well-to-do New Yorkers left town every autumn, the fever season, and Amory regretted not doing so. So the following year, he bought his first common land lot. Soon, he bought out many of his neighbors within the pre-park and also east of Fifth Avenue. Some of the park's most beloved landscapes were James Amory's farm. The Mall, Bethesda Terrace, Cherry Hill, Rumsey Playfield, the Dean, and large parts of the East Green and Sheep Meadow. They were all James Amory's farm. But James Amory was not just a farmer. He was also, like his father, a maker of elite sporting goods, especially celebrated for their branded horsewhips. In 1805, Amory moved his horsewhip business and his apprentices to the farm, now Central Park. After endless surfing of the web to find an Amory horsewhip, I was desperate to find one. I finally found this elegant riding crop with the name Amory inscribed on the handle in silver and the initials GW on its tip. It was owned by none other than George Washington, the country's most famous equestrian, and the riding crop is the pride of the Mount Vernon collection. We now travel west to a section of Bloomingdale that became Seneca Village, the largest African-American property-owning community in New York and possibly the country. The people in Seneca Village noted their community was in Yorkville, but most likely because it lay west of York Hill, the site of the receiving reservoir, now the Great Lawn. But all previous landowners considered it as a part of Bloomingdale. So in the book, I do too. But before the establishment of Seneca Village in 1825, the land had been owned since the 17th century and cultivated as early as the 1790s. After many real estate transfers, a Quaker watchman named Joseph Pearsall was the first to buy the 17-acre division that would 22 years later become Seneca Village. After a few more transfers, the land was purchased in 1824 by John Whitehead and his wife Elizabeth. Whitehead was a licensed cartman, a prestigious profession held exclusively by white men who most often held nativist and racist views. But Whitehead was different from the other cartmen, and historian Graham Russell Hodges helped me with this, and he is an expert on cartmen and Black history of New York, though he thought that Whitehead seemed to be an outlier. My research showed that Whitehead was also quite wealthy. He lived on Orchard Street, and most likely held progressive views, believing in eternal salvation for all people, no matter what religion. Though some historians have dismissed Whitehead as a greedy speculator, his actions strongly suggest otherwise. Just like today, or before the internet, when one wanted to sell real estate, they would place an ad in a newspaper. But when Whitehead purchased the site, no ads were posted suggesting a prior arrangement or agreement between him and the Black community. Whitehead bought the 17-acre site in 1824. He had a surveyor divide it into 200 lots, and in 1825, he began to sell them exclusively to members of the Black community. After his death in 1836, Whitehead's widow and daughter followed suit, selling to the Black community with only one exception. Time constraints prevent me from discussing all the information that went into the research on Seneca Village, so I'll offer only a few aspects here. Let's talk about the name Seneca Village. It has been a mystery since the community was first brought to our attention by historians Roy Rosenzweig and Elizabeth Blackmar in their book, The Park and the People, in 1992. And in chapter 17, I offer a possible explanation for it. But what I want to just stress here is that in my research, and I read hundreds of documents, I could not find during the 32 years of the community's existence the name Seneca Village mentioned in any personal or public record, no legal document, no letter, deed, diary, will, court case, map, tax record, newspaper article, real estate ad, government paper, or annual report by the commissioners of Central Park. Hundreds of documents, not once a mention of the name Seneca Village that we use now. It is certain that the name was exclusively called such by outsiders to the community and never by a landowner, a renter, a mortgage document, a petitioner, or a descendant of the village landowners. At its peak, the community had approximately 200 residents, living in about 50 dwellings. The landowners were predominantly Black, and renters were either Black or people of Irish and German descent. My research revealed hundreds of transfers of property during the life of the community, proof that real estate investment and capital gains were not exclusive to white New Yorkers. Evidence shows that Seneca Village was a community constantly in flux, and as such, became a vehicle for Black empowerment, Black enrichment, and enfranchisement through the buying and selling of real estate. As author Carla Peterson, a great-granddaughter of Seneca Village landowners Joseph and Elizabeth Marshall, wrote about the Black middle class in her book, Black Gotham, quote, "Just as much as personal income, land was a good investment to be bought and sold for a profit," end quote. Between the years 1829 and 1836, 1/3 of Whitehead buyers sold their land and homes for a profit during the great financial boom of the period. Most often they sold to other Black families, adding to their existing property, or new buyers wishing to join the community, make a good investment, and gain the right to vote. After the 1821 New York State Constitutional Convention, only Black men who owned property assessed at $250 or more could vote. White men, of course, had no suffrage restrictions whatsoever. That also was determined at the Constitutional Convention. In the financial panic of 1837, several landowners lost their jobs, and consequently lost their property due to mortgage foreclosure or unpaid assessments. The properties were then absorbed by mortgagees, generally white investors, who had given Black owners a mortgage. In the early 1850s, several Black landowners also sold out to white speculators just before the idea for Central Park took hold. Many of the Seneca Village landowners never lived in the community, but owned or rented homes downtown. For the most part, they were the leaders in both social and political Black community. Albro Lyons on the left, his brother-in-law Peter Guignon on the right, met as students at the African Free School, the most advanced educational opportunity for Black children in New York City. Lyons and Guignon had ownership of their Seneca Village lots through their wives, whose parents had purchased the property. Until the Married Women's Property Act was passed in 1848, only the husband of a married couple could own property. Even if his wife owned it or inherited it prior to the marriage, it reverted to the husband, unless the couple had a prenup, which we did not invent recently, and many people, I learned, did have one, and many Seneca Village residents must have also had one. Several Black religious leaders also bought or rented land in Seneca Village. Just like Albro Lyons, the Reverend Charles B. Ray left and Theodore Wright Center both had homes that were downtown stops on the Underground Railroad. There is a very strong possibility that they might have been planning to have one in Seneca Village as well. Reverend James Ann Gloucester on the right was also their associate and activist for civil rights, and most likely also harbored fugitive enslaved people in his Brooklyn home or church. But it was his activist wife, Elizabeth Ann Gloucester, a wildly successful entrepreneur, who stands out in the Seneca Village story. She began her real estate career by purchasing 2 lots in Seneca Village, one of them on the site of the beautiful Cherry Tree LA on the west side of the reservoir that was in bloom only a few weeks ago. Elizabeth's life is a fascinating one, and at her death in 1883, she was one of the richest Black women in America. Here is an example of her business acumen and foresight. When she received her award for her Seneca Village properties in 1856, she used some of it to buy a lot near Fifth Avenue and 98th Street near the future Central Park, knowing full well that it would prove to be an outstanding investment, and it was. The history of becoming Central Park is the 3rd section of the book, from the first conception for a large municipal park in the 1840s through to the taking of the last 4 blocks of the park in 1863. One of the most burning questions that people had, myself included, was to discover the exact amount each landowner received for their property from the city. Even more importantly, was the award or money fair? Was it fair? According to Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution, a governmental agency could take property through eminent domain as long as the owner received, quote, just compensation, unquote, determined by the courts as fair market value. In 1856, the city paid over $5 million for the land from 59th Street to 106th Street, including the common lands still owned by the city of New York. I desperately wanted to find that information and searched every archive to find the releases to the owners, but it was always the same polite apology. Sorry, we don't have those papers. One day, surfing the web, I found a 1901 report listing every archive and every record in the state of New York and the city of New York by noted Columbian historian Herbert L. Osgood. And after hours and hours of mind-numbing scrolling, there it was on page 111, quote, 7 volumes relating to expenditures for Central Park, 1856 to 1858. Bingo. The records did exist, but where were they now? That was the question. Unfortunately, Osgood's precious information did not help in my search, but I knew the volumes absolutely had to be somewhere. Jump ahead to September 2017, when up popped an email from my good friend, genealogist Aaron Goodwin, the author of a book on the holdings of the municipal archives. The email included a photograph of the 7 missing volumes found in the Brooklyn storehouse of the municipal archives. Did I want to see them, he asked. Here is one page from Seneca Village landowner Elizabeth Mcgowan, who received $1,550 for her property, lot number 37. It was on 86th Street. She received $810 for her 2-story house and shed, and $740 for her lot, which lay along 86th Street, considered by the surveyors as an avenue, which was assessed at a much higher value. The lot awards were plotted onto a grid, and the determining factors seemed consistent with the real estate mantra, location, location, location. Lots close to the developing cities, 59th Street, were the most valuable. They got the most money. Lots fronting an avenue or along 86th Street were worth more. Corner lots were worth more. Avenue lots between 5th and 6th Avenue were slightly longer than the rest of the lots, contributing to their higher value. Lots and homes in the middle of the block were valued less than those on the avenue. Neither topography, nor the condition of the property, nor the owner's financial or social status, race, or nationality seems to have been a deciding factor. Location of the property determined the size of the award. The closer to the developing city downtown, the higher the payment. The most valuable properties were on 59th Street, and those in the 60s, east or west, were the most valuable. The least were at the north end at 106th Street. They probably thought it would be centuries before that would be developed. So there are so many stories and histories that I didn't have time to share with you today. But I hope you will read the book and also look out for my website, beforecentralpark.com. It's not up yet, where I will be continuing my research, inform you of book-related issues, events, and tours, and feature guest bloggers or to contact me with questions. Of course, if anyone listening does not belong to the New York Society Library, you are really missing out on one of New York's greatest assets. Please join. And of course, we at the Central Park Conservancy would also love it if you would join us, if you love Central Park. Thank you again for this wonderful opportunity to share my research with you tonight. In the time left, I am happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Sara Cedar Miller. That was absolutely fascinating. And I'm seeing some very positive comments in the chat. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us and for your questions and comments. If you've got questions for Ms. Miller, do pop them in the chat, which you're seeing to the right of your screen. I do see one initial question here. I think thinking of the purchases of land that then became the park, do you have any sense of those values in today's dollars?
I do. I don't recall them now because I'm really bad at numbers. But there's a wonderful website that everyone should know about who cares about learning what something might have been valuable then to now, called Measuring Worth, WORTH, all one word, measuringworth.com. You put in There are many different ways to do it, but you put in a year and a number, like $50 in 1850. What is that worth today? And up it comes. And I used it all the time. And a lot of my footnotes, I tell you the value, not so much in the text, but you can do it by labor, by consumer price index. There's all different ways in which it's one of the most little known and most valuable website for historians.
That is super useful, and I think many of us who read history will definitely take advantage of that. Thank you. Here's a great question. I was wondering about this a little bit too. Paul Kaplan asks, slavery was in New York until 1826. Can you discuss the role that slavery played in the settlement and in early Central Park history or history of the area?
That's a great question. I cover it a great deal in the book. So with the Dutch, who came and enslaved people, and the Montaigne de Forest homestead, which was probably up at the north end of the park or slightly past it, would have been helped to be constructed by enslaved people. And we know for a fact that the Mcgowans, whose tavern we saw and talked about, they owned enslaved people. The Mcgowans weren't so important, but Catherine Mcgowan, who married Daniel Mcgowan, was a Benson, and the Bensons owned half of Harlem. So until that day, I didn't pay very much attention to well, I didn't know she was enslaved, but what James Riker, who wrote a book on Harlem, called Lenore Benson, a colored woman. I didn't pay much attention to her because I didn't think she was relevant to the story. But the minute the light bulb went off that it was the Benson family I should be researching, not the Mcgowans, then all of a sudden I started caring about Lenore Benson. And chapter 3 of the book is to me, the most incredible story in the whole book. And it is about how Lenore Benson gains her manumission, her freedom, by buying a sliver of Central Park. It is probably the only story in the entire, it's too complicated for a PowerPoint. There's a lot of elements, and you have to understand the laws of the New York State and what Black people could do and enslaved people. But Lenore owned only possibly the perimeter of Central Park from 109th to 110th, all of Duke Ellington Circle, and going towards Madison Avenue up to 113th Street. She owned a 4-acre plot, and how she got it and how that helped her gain her freedom is my favorite story in the book.
That is fantastic. That's really a tantalizing glimpse there. Thank you. Gosh, some great questions here. By the way, audience members, I did pop the link for Ms. Miller's coming website before centralpark.com in the chat, so you can click right through to it and bookmark it if you'd like right now. So looking at some of these terrific questions, so you were talking about Mcgowan's Tavern and its history. Have any archaeological artifacts from the tavern been found, or do we know any more about kind of daily life at the tavern? Like, what did they serve? Booze, I imagine.
Well, I did try. I tried like crazy. Booze, yes, absolutely. And they had, they grew things, fruit trees, and the fruit trees usually became brandy. Jacob Dykeman owned it first, but he became married to a Benson. So it's really about the Bensons, but, and they would have grown hops. Oh, there was a huge hops garden in the east of, it could be as recent near Central Park as like the Museum of the City of New York. I even think it could have been conservatory garden, but it definitely was east of it. People talk about the hop garden, and they would have gotten their hops. I guess it was communally, doesn't seem to be owned by a person. It seems like it was communally owned and everybody drank beer, and they would get the hops from the hop garden, which was definitely in what we now call the Upper West Side borderline with maybe East Harlem. But we do know, I don't know much of what they ate. It would have been typical fare of whatever, but we know that Andrew Mcgowan fed George Washington's troops. And because there was a bill, he sent a bill. And so we know, I don't know what they ate, but we know that's who ate there a lot. But it was a major stop on the road. Everybody ate there. Everybody slept there. And there's a lot of discussion of the first tavern in Central Park, which was owned by Metche Cornelis earlier in the 1600s. There's a lot of her family, the Courtrights. There's a huge history about them, but I don't know specifically about the food. Archaeologically, I do believe that the Central Park Conservancy did some digging. We did a thorough study of the upper park from 97th Street, 96th Street to 110, because we were going to be doing the Harlem Mere and all of the projects up at the north end, and landmarks requires, a survey. So that's how I got involved in all of this, is because I was the photographer photographing with Richard Hunter of Hunter Research, who was hired to do this archaeological assessment. And it really, whet my appetite for the pre-park's history.
That's amazing. I was actually going to ask how exactly you got into this, but I'm sure you had a lot of the bits and pieces of knowledge coming in from having worked for the Conservancy, worked with the Conservancy.
Exactly. I mean, the Conservancy I came in year 4, so I did see it, but we didn't even know about Seneca Village in 1984 when I started. That was only published, Rosenzweig and Blackmore published the book in 1992. I remember learning about the blockhouse, of course, is a giant relic of the War of 1812. So, I knew about the War of 1812 and Fort Clinton, and I knew about the Native American Trail. There was some stuff, but not a whole lot, which is what drove me to take this on.
Splendid. So great question here. Do we know if any trees in the park now are old enough to predate the park?
That's a really good question. We do know that there are some really old trees in the park. One of them, I saw it today, is on the mall. 2 of them are English elms on the mall. They're really old and huge. The girth is enormous. One of them stands right out. It's near the Indian hunter's sculpture. And so they could very well have been planted very early on. And of course, they weren't planted from seed, so they would have planted. The mall was planted, in the 1858, but those trees died. And then in 1859, those trees lived until the turn of the century. And then the trees that are on the mall now were planted 100 years ago this year. They are centenary trees. They were planted in 1922. But of course, they weren't seeds. So they are over 100 years old, but we'll celebrate the planting of the elms. The third planting of the elms are the ones we love today.
That sense of continuity of natural history and human history is just really remarkable. Yeah. So you talked about how Seneca Village didn't get its name, essentially, or how we assume that it had this name, but it didn't really. Do we know how it did, in fact, start getting called that, if it wasn't called
Yes,
that in the way that we thought?
yes. It's too complicated to go into because there's a lot of steps and it's pure conjecture. But what we do know is that the first mention of it written down is in a pamphlet dated 1872 by Thomas McClure Peters, who was the reverend who had a mission school in the All Angels Church. He was a reverend at St. Michael's on the west side, and he would come to do Sunday school with another Reverend Richmond, and they named it. They said it was called Seneca, not village. The word village, I don't know where that came from, but Seneca, the community called Seneca, and so that was Thomas McClure Peters. Then that's it until 1907, when his son John Punnett Peters writes a book about St. Michael's, the history of St. Michael's. And in it, he says very derogatory, racist, and horrible things about Irish and black people, and goes on and on about Seneca Village. But he wasn't even alive, or I think he was 7 when Seneca Village ended. So we, all of this, they were working doing Sunday school in the 1850s when Egbert Ville was doing a self-appointed survey of Central Park. And it's Ville, too complicated here to discuss, but I believe that it's the reverends and Ville who met, and it's Ville whose plan for Central Park, well, I might as well say it because I'm almost saying it. He named all of the sites in his plan for Central Park after Native American tribes. And the minute I read that, it's the one sentence in the Herald Tribune from 18 something, it said that, and it was a reporter who was trying to follow the story of Central Park. And when the reporter says that Ville's plan, which no one has ever seen, it's lost to history. We have a plan, but not that plan. And that plan had names of every avenue, drive, road, path in his park plan. And he said he named them all after, he said, Indian names. And the minute I read that, I went, Seneca. And so probably the road that he had randomly next to Seneca Village, and then from there it became, perhaps because the reverends may have known him. This is pure conjecture at this point, but that's what his plan definitely said, because that is documented, but that the reverends would have picked up on it and continued it in their pamphlet in 1872. That is my conjecture, but I have never read a better idea. I mean, we'll never know, probably. We'll never know.
No, that makes sense, though. It is kind of tangled, but that is how place names often get their names, as we know in other places. So the use of Seneca then doesn't have to do with Seneca people being in the area, or it's coincidental.
No, it was the Lenape.
Yeah. So obviously there's loads that we know, and I'm sure loads that have been lost, but about the Lenape people who would have lived on Manhattan Island prior to colonization. Can you maybe share a little bit of favorite anecdote, a favorite fact about the Lenape?
Well, of course, the land was mainly poor. And so the Lenape, probably before the Dutch, they just traversed through it. Maybe they hunted, but there was never settlement, no archaeological fines of any kind. They had specific kinds of places that they liked to settle, and none of it has shown up in Central Park at all, in the land that became Central Park. But they did do the trail. But then when the Dutch came, the whole point of New Amsterdam and the Dutch West India Company was to get beavers. And Eric Sanderson in Mannahatta, that wonderful book that was like my Bible, and he was tremendously helpful to me. There is a map, and in it is of where the beavers would have been, and all over Central Park there would have been beavers, and the beavers were the currency, and it's also how the Native Americans got connected to the Dutch. And so they would have hunted out the beavers at that point and moved further and further around the island, and then further and further north. But we know that they probably, since Central Park was such a beaver-rich area, they would have definitely hunted here, and very possibly other things, but no settlement has ever come to light.
That's very interesting, especially since it's so densely settled today. It is how things shift. Good. So a couple of other good questions here, and then we'll kind of move towards wrapping up. So audience members, if you have other questions, now would be the time to add them to the chat. Thanks, Sydney Stark, for throwing in a good fact here. Discussing the prenup agreement issue. It was a common legal device for the Dutch, and women were allowed to own property and get divorced. So that's good to know. So that suggests that the changes then came during the British takeover of the island, if women then weren't owning their own property.
Yes. Yeah, the British changed all that.
And quite a lot of interest here in the families who lived in Seneca Village. If there's perhaps anything that you didn't get to share earlier that you want to share, but a specific question here. So if there were a lot of Black families, but also a lot of white immigrant, Irish, et cetera, families, do we know if they formed a community together? Did they intermarry? Did they party together, or were they separate from one another?
Well, the All Angels Church was integrated. It was both. The AME Zion Church was predominantly, if not all, Black, as was the African Union Church. But the All Angels Church, which came later, was integrated church. And so they certainly prayed together. And, it was a small, very dense community in an area where there wasn't, until you got over closer to Broadway, Bloomingdale Road, that there was more density. And so, I'm sure people did communicate. There's one instance that is in chapter 12, maybe, about Sally Wilson, who lived in Seneca Village, and how the Wagstaff family, who lived on what would basically be around Cedar Hill, right near the Metropolitan Museum of Art and Fifth Avenue and 79th Street, helped her legally and did things for her. That is very touching. And so we know, if not within the community itself, we know that other white landowners who were wealthier, and she probably worked for them as a domestic, but they got her land to be owned by Sally, not her husband, just the way this happened in the Black community a lot. And one of the first things on my blog, when my website eventually gets up, hopefully by the end of June, will be about the women of Seneca Village. And it talks about the whole marriage and the property owners and what women did to get to own their property. And it's fascinating, part of women's history that I knew nothing about. But it was the way in England, and they followed Blackstone. When America followed the law, it was Blackstone's law, and it was the coverture, in which the husband protected the wife, coveted her, and owned everything. She could own nothing, couldn't have a contract, couldn't have a will, couldn't do a deed. The women had no rights, no legal rights whatsoever until 1848, when the Women's Property Act of New York was radical. And so I talk a lot about that.
Yeah, that's great. So everybody who's commenting about interesting things about Seneca Village in the chat, do keep an eye out for that blog post coming up soon. Yeah, and no custody of children too, I think, was the other big issue about culture.
Right. Yeah, no, the children belong to the husband. So the opposite now.
So question here, where did you do archival research other than the New York Public Library? Other libraries or archives that you want to give a shout out to?
The New York Historical Society is, amazing. And the, what's it called? The Division of Old Records, which is the New York court system. The New York State Library in Albany, the archives in Albany. Yeah, I never left New York State, I will say that. New York is amazing for its archives, just amazing.
That's great. That's makes us, as another historic institution, makes us very happy.
No, I would just get a thrill. Several times I burst into tears just holding a document. There's this guy, Julian, that's how you pronounce his name, Ludlow, who bought a piece of land from Samuel Stillwell, and that piece of land became a great part of Seneca Village. And I unfold this huge thing, and there it is, this deed to the land that would become Seneca Village. And and it's his daughters who gave the money to build All Angels Church. The Ludlow sisters bought. They owned he didn't give up his property. His daughters inherited it, and they took several of the lots and gave it over to the church. So,
So, maybe another question or two that sound good. Great. Are there any federal census records of this area that you found?
You mean Seneca Village?
Or yes,
or the whole
or
park?
Any of the
whole park?
The park,
oh yeah,
I think.
there are, yeah. They're right there. 1790 is the first one. And I kept trying to follow people after they left, and it wasn't Central Park anymore, but I would say, up till 1860, it's every 10 years. But what's really important for research on New York and Central Park is the 1855 New York State Archives. They did a census. They did a census every 5 years, but they don't have the New York City one, but we do have the 1855 one. And so you can read that, and Ancestry, and the National Archives, and you find a lot. That was how we determine how many people lived in Seneca Village in 1855, because they came out with a census that year. It's not always accurate.
Oh, very good.
Not always accurate, but everything is guesswork, and hopefully an educated guesswork.
Very good. Do we know a lot about sanitation and drinking water in Seneca Village or the other? Yeah.
Well, Seneca Village, I don't know specifically. They were, after 1836, right up against the receiving reservoir, but I don't think that, they didn't run pipes to the village, even though they were next door. Maybe there was some kind of arrangement with the reservoir keepers, because they lived in Seneca Village too, John Geary and John Wallace, but I don't count them as residents, because when everyone else had to leave, they got to stay, because that was their place of business, the reservoir. So their home was there, but they didn't leave. They didn't leave until 1859. So they were in the village, but not really of the village, I think. But when you look at maps or when you read real estate ads, that's how I found out a lot of it, because nothing's changed. You want to sell your property, you have real estate ads, and people tell you about their wells that they dug or their stream of fresh water. And you look at old maps and there's a duck pond on James Amory's farm, which is now on the East Green. You know, there's a duck pond here. You know, it's like East 69th Street. No. So there was lots of fresh water and lots of springs, and one in Seneca Village, right at the edge of it, called Tanner Spring, that probably went underground, because I saw an old map that had a spring in what would definitely be the Seneca Village area. So yeah, people would have had fresh water. That's why they could settle, because of course, if you don't have fresh water, you can't settle.
Yes, indeed. That's great. That's one, as with all of this, just wonderfully detailed daily life details to have unearthed, or whatever the appropriate term is. Good. So maybe move towards drawing to a close. I'd just love to throw you a slightly personal question. So you have all this consciousness of the many layers of history in all the parts of the park, and indeed elsewhere in the city, like you mentioned, Kips Bay in its relation to the Revolutionary War, for instance. What's it like when you walk around the city? I mean, do you constantly have a feel of the sort of ghosts or the ancestors or the layers of history? Or New York is always rebuilding? Does it always seem new? Or something else?
You know, more locally, I do, when I learn something, because really, my New York City history before I started this project was it very much focused on understanding Central Park from the point of view of the 1840s and the 1850s and 60s, but not so much downtown. And I just didn't know that much, to be honest. And so this threw me into a whole new world of New York City history. But when I walk through the park, I think of James Amory, because I see now the topography, and I know Olmsted and Fox changed it, but I can see where, this is why he would have had his house here, because it's kind of a hill and he wanted an elevation, or I understand so much of the park through who lived here before. And I'm hoping that when people read the book and we do more work, that people will have the time travel. You can time travel to the Lenape, or you can time travel to the Dutch, you can time travel to the Revolutionary War. I mean, you can stand on the composting area and go, George Washington had a meeting here. He didn't sleep there, but maybe he took a nap. But either way, it's like the park to me has become this like time travel, time warp, wonderful place that, it is alive with people, alive with wonderful, ordinary, everyday people that live their lives, were good people. And now we know a little bit more about some of them, and hopefully keep going to learn more.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. It just makes me proud to live in the city and be adjacent to this park. And I think a lot of us probably feel that way. Someone says, can't wait to read your book. I'm ordering it right away. So that also, I'm sure, speaks for many of us. So I think we'll wrap up there. Thank you so much, Sara Cedar Miller. Thank you, audience members. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me.